Hey y'all, Scott here. I've decided to start playing game systems with names that perfectly describe me, so I'm gonna start playing the Microvision.
What's shaped like a brick and gives you hours of fun? It's a close second. The Nintendo Game Boy. That's right, it's a minor. Easily one of the most important systems in gaming history, and for good reason. There's some truth to why old people call anything that beeps a Game Boy. They worry me. But every time you see a portable video game device in a cartoon or something, it's almost always modeled after the original Game Boy. 2 buttons, a D-pad, cartridge slot. This thing is so portable game system. And even though I never officially owned one before my virgin phase, it doesn't feel like it. The original Game Boy launched a line of systems that lasted over 20 years, most models being compatible with the games from that first one. I remember bringing my Game Boy Advance to kindergarten, to which most 80-year-olds would say, that makes me feel old. The other kids and I would swap games around and try them out on our own systems, and I saw some of them having these weird gray cartridges. I was only used to the Game Boy Color and Advance ones. Then one of the kids whipped out their Game Boy. It was the original, and even back then I thought, oh, we gotta see what happens when we put a newer game in there. This is amazing! No matter what era of Game Boy you grew up with, you still sort of feel that attachment towards the others. It's all Game Boy at the end of the day. Ever since, I've always had a huge interest in that first era of Game Boy. I loved my Game Boy Color and Advance games, but I wanted to see what it was like one generation earlier. And now that I waste my time, I can finally use the original Game Boy and see what it's like. It fucking stinks. The Game Boy was created in response to the booming success of Nintendo's home console, the Nintendo Entertainment System, and the limitations of their LCD games, the Game & Watch series. The NES gave you long-lasting experiences, each on their own cartridges, some of which were high-score-based games straight out of the arcade, but many were taking gaming to the next level. Rich stories, new worlds you want to explore, definitive endings, just like a divorce. The Game & Watch games were a line of handhelds that contained one game on each, using an LCD display like a calculator. These pretty much had to be arcade-style games. Just see how long you can last, try to win, like a divorce. Now, handheld game systems with cartridges weren't anything new, but they weren't anything good. Mostly dumb, simple, high-score-based games. A few of them were kind of fun, but most of these, they mainly just gave your thumbs a job. So what if we took how rich and deep the games on NES can be and shrunk them down to fit in a mouse? That was what Gunpei Yokoi was born to do. The designer of numerous Nintendo toys, the Game & Watch, and Cataracts went in and created a portable game system using interchangeable cartridges and a dot matrix screen. That sounds more impressive than it is. It's a manually operated fiber divider. The project was codenamed after the screen, Dot Matrix Game, or DMG, and didn't have a final name until Shigesato Itoi suggested the name Game Boy. This thing was developed with durability, longevity, and budgetary constraints in mind, launching at only $89.99 on July 31st, 1989 here in North America, April 21st, 1989 in Japan, and September 28th, 1990 in Europe. Nintendo has almost always been about fun on a budget, and nowhere was that more obvious than with the Game Boy. Look at this box, the future is here, fucker, and it's called 1989. This looks incredible, and then you play it! Really funny stand-up routine, dog shit system. Even when Nintendo was being more realistic with their images, like on the back of the box here, this screen still looks leagues better than what we actually get. A dot matrix display, what does that mean? It means let's get the hell out of here! Well, I guess if the Game & Watch has a display like a basic calculator, the Game Boy has a display like a more advanced calculator, one that can display more than just variations of the letter O. I mean, it still displays any old spray you could ask for here. It definitely can be used to play video games from this era, it just so happens to be ass green. Thank God I'm colorblind. The screen here is the Game Boy's biggest flaw. Not only is it not lit in any way, shape, or form, but it's not just black and white, it's black and puke. They used a green display with no colors because it helped the non-color visuals pop out the best at a low cost.
Or they just thought it'd be funny.
This is easily one of the most notorious elements of the original model. You can't use it. We have a contrast dial, which helps us see in numerous different lighting conditions, but for playing it dark, have an open mouth. We got the volume slider, headphone jack, and speakers for stereo sound, an extension port for accessories, on and off switch, a port for an AC adapter, a battery compartment begging for 4 AA's, 8 A's for just one device, and a full suite of buttons, the exact same buttons you'll find on an NES controller. They were obviously cutting corners a lot, but Nintendo ensured you would get as close to a console experience as possible with this thing. Of course, other companies responded, and they responded big. Just bring the damn TV with you at this point. Competition towards the Game Boy quickly emerged. Systems by Atari and Sega had full color displays that were in fact lit up. These systems were more powerful, and I think people bought them out of fear of being crushed. All signs pointed to these things wiping the floor with the Game Boy, but Nintendo had a few aces up their sleeve. The initial price point was significantly cheaper due to the Game Boy's cost efficiency. Not using a color display will do that to you. They're all about saving money. I'm sure Nintendo employees eat cereal with water. Due to using cheaper technology, the Game Boy was not only more portable than the competition, its battery life was actually tolerable. I can't remember the last time I put batteries in this thing. It's just been run off the same ones for years. It can withstand 15 hours of continuous play on 4 AA's. Sega's Game Gear and Atari's Lynx contributed to the battery life movement we're dealing with today. I think the Game Boy's design was far more appealing to everybody. These things honestly both look the exact same. The Game Boy was unique and it feels great to play. It may be bulky by today's standards, but you can still fit it in a pocket. All the buttons, the D-pad, they feel fantastic, like actual console controller buttons. Handhelds usually have the audacity to include small clicky buttons to fit on a slimmer, tinier device compared to home console controllers. The Game Boy has these big, meaty buttons that just feel right. They feel substantial, and none of Nintendo's future portables really replicated this feeling. It's a little awkward, obviously not the best it could possibly be, but it's well designed for 1989, and at its price point, it accomplishes what it set out to do, and while that definitely added to the reason the Game Boy absolutely drained the Lynx's blood for fun, the core reason it did so well was the games. It's in the fucking name. The Game Boy launched with 5 games here in North America, with one being notoriously bundled in. Not Yakuman. Tetris was already a well-known PC game at the time, but the idea to bundle it in with the Game Boy, genius. Nintendo was considering to put the game Super Mario Land in with the package, but was told while that would help the Game Boy appeal to kids, packing in Tetris would help the Game Boy appeal to everybody. So, in North America, the Game Boy launched with a Tetris game cartridge, not only helping the system, but the Tetris brand as a whole. These two things go hand in hand. Neither one of them would be the great success they became if not for each other. Tetris on the Game Boy continues to be one of the best versions of Tetris. I know what you may be saying, Scott, fucking Tetris is fucking Tetris. No man, Grass was way better back then. Hear me out, it's crazy, but not every version of Tetris gets things right. The controls feel off, the core Tetris gameplay is altered ever so slightly, but if you want the most pure and perfect version of Tetris, it's on the Game Boy. The iconic theme is here, it all controls well, it works perfectly within the Game Boy's limitations, like everything appears on screen just fine. It doesn't mess around with modes that are kinda cute, then you never play again. It knows what you want, you jump in, play Tetris, jump out. It's basic, but not to a fault, and that's what I like about this version. It's simple, but it's perfectly simple. This helped the Game Boy tremendously, but that doesn't mean there weren't other games aiding to its success. Right alongside the system's launch came Super Mario Land. I always found this cover art to be so modern looking for a Mario game released in 1989. Prior to this, Mario artwork was still in its Peach Fuzz era. This one feels right in line with official art for the series released today. Of course, Super Mario Bros. Helped to catapult the NES into superstardom, really being a game everybody had to try for themselves. Truly a revolution, so it's fair to expect Super Mario Land to be the same. This game creeps me out. I love Super Mario Land, and I think most good people do. But I think it's mostly because of how charming the game is with how primitive and simple it can be. It's a very basic and short Mario game, though it has a few elements unique to it. You don't get fireballs, you get super balls that bounce around. Turtles explode on impact. A few side-scrolling shooting stages, and we have our first title with a question mark in the middle. The physics are messed up here. If you're running, it doesn't really carry into your jump that well. You fall like a rock. Precise jumps are hard to make. But none of this really matters. Like I said, the game is just so damn charming. It's not difficult, it's super short. You can beat it in like 30 minutes, so it's like, why complain about it? Is being critical about Super Mario Land going to change the world? Why does it matter that it doesn't control perfectly? It met the requirements of being Super Mario Bros. On a portable system, and that was a big deal. It still feels like Mario, and you could take it wherever you wanted. Sure, the screen of the Game Boy gets really blurry when there's a lot of movement. It can be hard to see enemies coming at you when you're running, but it's still playable. It's charming as all hell, and I still love going back to it over and over again. The game is simple, yet still Mario. The problems with the game are more so fun little quirks rather than deal breakers due to how short and easy the game is. I adore this game. Critically, you could tear it apart, but I feel like most people can see right past the flaws and enjoy this game for what it was back in 1989. The other launch titles were more so just the bare minimum of what Nintendo thought a game console needed at the time. Baseball and tennis, pretty much the same as the baseball and tennis games for the NES. Stay away. Then there was Alleyway, just a basic breakout clone, still fun and charming though, which is the opinion I have for most of these old Game Boy games. Yes, looking at them with a modern lens, they're all bitch simple. But being portable games in the late 80s, I find them to be more interesting than many home console counterparts they had. Like, I would so much rather play baseball or tennis on Game Boy than NES, and that may be because Nintendo's re-released their NES games far more often than their Game Boy ones, but I find these more endearing. The NES is more capable than this. The Game Boy, I'll take what I can get. Overall, not a bad launch lineup. 2 of the most iconic games on the entire platform, one of them packed in, a fun breakout game, and 2 sports titles if you want to get laid. The original Game Boy model wasn't the hottest looker though. This thing looks like it would just taste awful. So eventually, 6 years later, Nintendo released a line of Game Boys under the slogan, "Play it loud." The deaf revolted. These were the exact same systems from '89, but now there were so many different color options. This was during Nintendo's rambunctious phase, trying to be cool for all the 90s kids. Yeah, stick it to the man, buy a yellow Game Boy. These are pretty nice additions to the lineup, but this was 6 years after the launch. The Game Boy lasted so long, and for a giant chunk of its lifespan, it was still just that old brick. The next year, in 1996, Nintendo finally released a revision titled the Game Boy Pocket, and the most tolerable handheld goes to this. It is a fraction of the size, comes in a variety of colors, only costs $69.99. The screen is bigger, clearer, doesn't get as blurry during motion sequences, doesn't look fucking disgusting, only uses 2 AAA batteries instead of 4 AA's. This is a huge improvement, though I do still think the original has more character. Just look at the fonts for the buttons, this looks like a PowerPoint presentation. Plus, I don't think it's as comfortable as the '89 model. I don't like it when my hands on the back touch. Keep these things away from each other. But the Pocket helped rejuvenate the Game Boy, giving it a much needed modern makeover. It was still incredibly affordable, and at this point had a treasure trove of games in its catalog, plus most of the problems with the original were made much better now. But one thing still needed fixed. 2 years later, in 1998, only in Japan, Nintendo released the final revision, the Game Boy Light. One of the biggest issues with the Game Boy line was the lack of any light on the screen. You just straight up couldn't see it without some kind of light source. The Game Boy Light, however, popped a backlight into the display, which you can turn on and off. Without the light, this thing lasts 20 hours on 2 AA's, which is amazing. And then with the light on, it lasts for 12 hours, which is still very respectable. The handheld is very similar to the Game Boy Pocket in terms of design, but a bit larger, which makes it more comfortable. The backlight is pretty much just here so you can play in the dark. It doesn't make the screen more viewable in good lighting conditions. In fact, half the time I can't even tell it's on. It makes the handheld playable at night. That's pretty much all it does. You know, I was hoping it was gonna give me advice. The problem is, this revision released a mere months before Nintendo released the full upgrade, the Game Boy Color. Featuring a color screen and exclusive games, it was pointless to buy this, even if it had the backlight and the color didn't. Since these released so close to each other, it's understandable why this never left Japan. Also, America hates vision. It didn't make sense to make consumers decide between a light and a color when it was obvious the color was what Nintendo really wanted to sell here. The original Game Boy wasn't discontinued until 2003, living an incredible 14 years, and it really lived on for far longer than that. The Game Boy Color and Advance were compatible with these old games, with the Advance being discontinued in 2010. The Game Boy line was so popular, with the original first 3 models selling 64 million plus units before the Color's release in '98. And all of that can be attributed to the great games released for this thing.
Like Makken Chase and Mortal Kombat 2. I have a soft spot for the Game Boy library, but even the best games are often gimped in some ways. Though every Game Boy game I've played, I can always appreciate them, far more than a lot of other games from this era. It is so charming to go back to when this was portable gaming. It's fun to see where concessions were made and they aren't too egregious considering you're playing it on this, okay? What were you expecting?
These cartridges are adorable. They're like NES cartridges you can choke on more easily. And the NES is the best console compared to the Game Boy, as most of these titles feel like black and white NES games. The Game Boy definitely isn't as capable as the NES in many ways, so games sometimes don't run as smoothly as they do on there. But again, taking the era in which this was released into consideration, you're getting a fairly comparable experience on the go. The problem is, the Super Nintendo was right around the corner and was the primary system during the Game Boy's life. So while the Game Boy can do NES-style games quite well, bringing Super Nintendo-like games over cracks me up. We can see that with the sequel to Super Mario Land, released 3 years later, Super Mario Land 2, 6 golden coins. You collect coins all the time, who cares? Mario Land 1 was a solid portable take on the Mario formula, though it was kind of in the camp of good enough. That game on any hardware other than the Game Boy would be executed. Mario Land 2, well, that's actually just a flat-out great game, regardless of it being on the Game Boy or not. Definitely feels more like Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo, for better or for worse. The game does struggle with how big and chunky the sprites are. I mean, the original Mario Land, I was worried the sprites were my spittle on the screen. Here, everything is big and bold and I love it, but we can a lot more slow down because of that. Mario Land 2 does struggle a bit with being a full-size Mario game on the handheld, but that doesn't doesn't stop it from being one of the best Game Boy games. I'm not sure I'd consider it to be one of my favorite Mario games. I kind of feel like it's made cooler just because it's a Game Boy game. But it's a great title in its own right and deserves more recognition. It was the debut of Wario, I can't say that about myself. But they ended up taking him from this game and making him the whole focus of the third Mario Land, Wario Land Super Mario Land 3. Can't wait for Max Payne's Super Mario Land 4. I always forget there were 3 Mario Lands, but it's completely fair considering the third game is an inbred take on a third game. Super Mario Land 3 isn't a Mario Land game, much like how Super Mario World 2 isn't a Mario World game. They both take characters from the previous entries and give them their own spin-off series. They just had to give them a Mario subtitle to really sell it to ya. Sure. Wario Land is its own game. Starring Wario, it launched an entire series of mostly handheld platformers, including Wario Land 2 on the original Game Boy as well. What makes Wario Land work is how it really throws you a curveball. You head into it expecting a Mario game, but you get off-key music and mechanics that make these games truly their own thing. There aren't a ton of Mario spin-offs on here. NES games like Yoshi, Yoshi's Cookie, and Dr. Mario got Game Boy versions. Dr. Mario's a weird one considering it's all about matching colors. Who did they to make this work? There was one Mario spin-off that was the Game Boy Zone though. Something fresh, something new, something definitively Mario. Mario's Picross, because the Ted Danson deal fell through. Picross is a puzzle game, kind of like mixing crossword puzzles with Sudoku. Each row and column has a number, and that denotes how many squares are shaded in. So you compare each and figure out where exactly to chip away, and we have art. This game has almost nothing to do with Mario outside of the menus and a few puzzles, but it doesn't stop me from loving this game to bits. It's such a fun and addictive puzzle game, and most critics say that too. It sold like ass. Well, at least we have Donkey Kong. That's the full name. Most people call it Donkey Kong 94 based on the year it was released. In a sentence, it's great. In a longer sentence, it's really great. I mean, this is a Game Boy game, a continuation of the arcade title. We all asked, what happens next? Another whole ass game! A puzzle platformer made specifically for the Game Boy. This isn't like Mario Land 2, where that's an amazing game that does sort of struggle with the limitations of the handheld. This was made with everything in mind. It is, in my opinion, the perfect Game Boy game. And they followed it up with a nightmare. The Donkey Kong Land series. 3 games, all meant to be supplemental titles to the 3 Donkey Kong countries on Super Nintendo. You have to admit, these are impressive on the system, and they are their own games. They take heavily from their home console counterparts, but these are unique level designs. It's just, my god, these don't work on this thing. The sprites are so detailed, which is impressive, but it makes the game nearly unintelligible. That's a problem with many Game Boy titles. They didn't take the screen's quality into consideration. I will say, it's not as bad as you think it'd be, but you just can't make out what's on here sometimes. Man, these are just the novelty to go back to today. Even back then, they were like, wow, it's Donkey Kong Country on the go. Now it's like, wow, they sold this. Donkey Kong 94 is definitely the one to go for. These are neat from a historical point of view, but just play the Super Nintendo games like Jesus. That was the biggest issue with Game Boy games, when they tried to be far more than what they could be. Like, stop it, man, you're gonna hurt yourself. If the Game Boy released a few years earlier, we wouldn't have had this issue as much, but because it was thriving during the reign of the Super Nintendo, Nintendo wanted to put Super Nintendo quality games on here, so we got games that tried to stand toe-in-toe with what was on consoles at the time. Case in point, The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. This is a full-blown Legend of Zelda game. It's pretty much the same length as Link to the Past on Super Nintendo. Nothing's compromised. If anything, Link's Awakening takes the core of Link to the Past and makes it work on a Game Boy. It's pretty crazy. Playing on an actual Game Boy model though, this is rough. I have no idea how anybody did this. I mean, at least with the Pocket, maybe. But I can't imagine playing this compared to the re-release they did for the Game Boy Color. Like, my god. The game also feels very shoehorned onto the platform. You have to switch between different items all the time in this game, like constantly, which forces you to go into the menu, swap out items, go back, swap them out again. It feels like if they made this game from the ground up for the Game Boy, they'd take the lack of buttons into consideration and not design a game around using all these items and having to swap between them over and over again. With that being said, Link's Awakening is a lovely game. It has so much charm being the first mainline portable Zelda adventure. They did some weird things with this one, including tons of cameos from other Nintendo properties. This is obviously a stone cold classic. The only problem is the system it was made for. When it got a full remake in 2019, it showed how much of this game at its core was already perfect. They only really changed things that were there due to the limitations of the Game Boy console, like the whole item swapping debacle. Other than that, it's the exact same game, and that speaks volumes of the original Link's Awakening's quality. This wasn't a completely watered down portable throwaway game. This was the real deal, and Nintendo's had that mentality with all of their handheld systems, which is why I think they've always succeeded. Whenever Sega or Sony would put out games on their portables, they were always lesser versions. Who cares about that Uncharted? It's just a side story. When Nintendo Nintendo made a Zelda game for the Game Boy, it was the next big Zelda game. When Nintendo made a Metroid game for the Game Boy, it was a mistake. What am I doing? Metroid 2 Return of Samus, a fair attempt at a Metroid game on the platform. To be honest, Metroid during this time period was a bit too cryptic and obtuse for my Donkey Kong 94 brain. These games are so difficult to do anything in without a map. You have to draw one out yourself. In 1991, sure. In 1994, go yourself. Well, Kid Icarus got a sequel on the Game Boy too. Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters, strangely a game that never released in Japan and was the only other Kid Icarus game until 2012 with Kid Icarus Uprising. This is basically more of the same from the NES game, but again, that's impressive and exactly what customers wanted. If you were buying Kid Icarus on the Game Boy, it was because you wanted Kid Icarus on the go, not a card game spin-off, Sony. That doesn't mean other companies didn't put their B teams on the Game Boy versions. We got a whole heap of third-party home console conversions, like 5 Mega Man games, some Castlevanias, Contras, a bunch of Final Fantasies that weren't actually Final Fantasy, they were random RPGs Square brought over to North America and called them Final Fantasy. These were all up in the air, like sometimes they can be good, and sometimes they're Castlevania the Adventure. I really have a love for the first Game Boy Mega Man game, Mega Man and Dr. Wily's Revenge. The Mega Man Game Boy games are like remixed, abridged versions of the NES ones, but sometimes they weren't just remixed, abridged versions, they were bad. Even then, I still look fondly upon all these games, even if they weren't that great. They give you fairly authentic portable takes on these franchises. Like Mega Man looks and plays like Mega Man, same with Castlevania, Double Dragon. The only exception I'll make is this fighting game, Street Fighter 2, Mortal Kombat, Killer Instinct. I feel really bad for the kids that said, Mom, that. Like, man, Mario's right over there! The fighting games felt more like things for your thumbs to do rather than actual engrossing video games to play. I mean, this gave you a Street Fighter 2-like experience on the go, but I just feel like you had way better options. Like, as handhelds progress, you can make an argument playing Super Street Fighter 4 on the 3DS helped you practice for playing the console version. No, there's not much to these versions. They're the fighting games on the Game Boy. A worthy attempt, but they just aren't what the Game Boy's good at. Like, puzzle games were the Game Boy's jam. Not only did we have Tetris, but Tetris 2. This isn't Tetris. Tetris Blast! Who the f*** are you? Tetris Attack. I love you, but stop lying. Kicks is great here. One of my favorite arcade games. A Taito classic published by Nintendo on the Game Boy. The Game Boy can handle this. Right? No matter how poor the hardware is, you're always gonna have somebody out there who wants to be a smartass. X was a Japan-only game published by Nintendo that laid the groundwork for Star Fox. 3D! In black and white! It's the future yesterday! Baseball 2000, a first-person shooter. Yeah, I mean, it's the Game Boy, it can do anything. I think Game & Watch Gallery helped show what the Game Boy was best at. These are remakes and ports of classic Game & Watch games, and it's a treat to have this era of Nintendo represented on the Game Boy, as it was its direct predecessor. Balloon Kid, a sequel to Balloon Fight, perfect fit for this thing. Great for simple, addictive gameplay. Space Invaders? Yeah, sure, it's great. The Game Boy may have had a lot of well-known franchises continue on it, but it started a few key ones. Mole Mania debuted on the Game Boy. That's something you hear every day.
We get it.
This is an obscure Nintendo-developed game. It's produced by Shigeru Miyamoto, and it's a fun puzzle game. You go between the top layer and bottom layer of each stage to get to the end. It feels like something that should have seen more success, but Nintendo realized kids hate moles. You! Wave Race started on the Game Boy. Yeah, Wave Race 64. That's a sequel to a Game Boy game just called Wave Race. I never hear anybody talk about this, and honestly, for the longest time, I just thought Wave Race 64 was the first Wave Race. They just put 64 on the title because it's Nintendo. They're crazy. They made a game about moles, okay? But shockingly more important was the conception of a white guy. Kirby's Dream Land debuted on this thing, ushering in the Kirby series as a whole. The box art illustrator didn't know he was supposed to be pink. Welcome to hell. The original Kirby's Dream Land was designed around being a beginner's game. It's stupid easy and short, but that's what it was always meant to be. Kirby's supposed to be a shut your brain off kind of game, and Dreamland is a fun one to blast through sometimes. This was followed up with an NES sequel, Kirby's Adventure, but back on the Game Boy, we got Dreamland 2, which was definitely a huge upgrade, but even back then, Nintendo milked the hell out of Kirby. Pinball Land, Block Ball, Star Stacker, Kirby got so many spin-offs on the Game Boy, it's ridiculous. It's probably because Kirby was the perfect choice for the face of that original brick. All of his games were simple, easy to pick up, and worked on the system well. Putting him in a pinball game, a breakout clone, a puzzle game, it all made sense. Kirby fits everywhere. Put him in court, I don't care. Well, those are the most iconic titles on the Game Boy. Of course, there were hundreds of garbage whatever games, but even the worst games, honestly, I still have a weird appreciation for them on this thing. Bad games are way more tolerable on the Game Boy, and I feel like it's because I look at everything here and appreciate it all due to the limitations. Rummaging through a crate full of old gray Game Boy cartridges, there's something magical about it. No matter how good or bad the game is, I just find original Game Boy games to have this undeniable charm about them. Being in black and white and on a system you have to hold up to a light to be able to play, it's weirdly endearing. And just the fact Nintendo supported the system with so many accessories shows other people agree. I mean, come on. The Game Boy camera? That's so stupid, I love it. At one point, this held the world record for smallest digital camera. Doesn't mean it's good, you can't hold me accountable for saying that. You can hook this up to the Game Boy printer to print off your pictures. It works across a few other games and uses receipt paper. That way, it doesn't require ink cartridges, just a specific roll of paper, which is such a Nintendo decision to make. The Super Game Boy allows you to play these games on a Super Nintendo on a TV, which made for the ability to actually enjoy some of these titles. We got screen lights and magnifiers, which just made things worse. Battery packs, the link cable, connecting your Game Boy to another one for multiplayer action. God damn it.
Pokemon is the biggest media franchise of all time. Starting on the original Game Boy, it helped keep the handheld alive for so long, releasing late in its life. It's an RPG series about collecting and battling monsters called Pokemon, and it spawned countless sequels, spin-offs, movies, music, merchandise. It's hard to think where Nintendo would be in the portable market today without Pokemon. Okay, I said it. Hey y'all, Scott here. I think I've reached a critical point in my life recently. I feel like I have to actually get up and do something rather than just piss around talking about the Game Boy Color or whatever. So, this is it. I need to decide, do I get up and contribute to society, or do I talk about the Game Boy Color?
Yes, finally, I can experience the Game Boy in color. The Game Boy line of systems, honestly the brand most synonymous with portable on-the-go gaming. Oh man, what am I gonna do on this road trip? Throw a couple Game Boys in the back, you'll be fine. This is the original Game Boy released in 1989. It obviously released that year, there was no way you could miss it. Obviously it was produced with performance and cost effectiveness in mind. An ass-green screen with no color, just varying shades of
This is fucking disgusting.
but it lasted forever on 4 AA batteries and was at a decent price point comparative to the other handheld competitors at the time. The Sega Game Gear and Atari Lynx had full color displays and they were lit up as well. You could actually see them. Who could possibly fathom wanting this in comparison to these? Well, Nintendo had an ace up their sleeve. You see, the Game Boy had Tetris, Mario, Zelda, Tetris, Donkey Kong Tetris, Golf, Tetris, it had Tetris. Basically, you bought this to play video games, you bought these if you had insecurities. The original Game Boy completely solidified Nintendo's reign on the handheld market, and nobody could really top them. They had a solid price point, battery life, and the best game library you could ask for. Did you really want to get caught playing Sonic Triple Trouble? While the Game Boy was a massive success, it obviously warranted a successor, or at the very least, an upgrade. You really think Nintendo looked at this and said, yeah, that's good? They did. It took them 7 years to admit this may not stand the test of time. 1996, we got a redesign, the Game Boy Pocket. More compact, a much clearer screen, but it still wasn't lit or anything. You still needed to bring a lighter if you wanted to play at night. Well, 2 years later, in 1998, Nintendo released another revision of the Game Boy, the Game Boy Light. Like they started to give a shit a decade in? The Game Boy Light was fundamentally the Game Boy Pocket, but not with a screen you could actually use in the dark. It was only released in Japan.
Nintendo knows what we like over here.
2 revisions, still no true successor to the handheld. All the Game Boy games coming out were still designed for the brick of '89. By '98, this thing was screaming, I'm 9 years old, please let me die. It's truly surprising Nintendo was able to make the Game Boy last that long with no true successor in sight. I mean, sure, they released the Virtual Boy in 1995.
They sure did.
Okay, that was a concept for a product that never should have left the research and development department. Nintendo delayed the Nintendo 64 and needed to release something, which oddly enough was the working title for this. This wasn't a successor to the Game Boy. In what realm was this a handheld? But by 1998, things needed to change. The fact was, the Game Boy experienced a resurgence in popularity due to the release of Pokemon. Game developers were getting antsy. They wanted more power. They didn't want to be restricted to hardware from the 80s. But for a true giant leap in technology, Nintendo needed to wait a few more years. They were in fact working on a true successor to the Game Boy, but it wouldn't be until 2001 for it to release. To satiate everybody in the meantime, the Game Boy Color came out. The same year as the Game Boy Light. What was the goal there? This is the Game Boy Color. It's the Nintendo console that won the attendance award in high school. It happened. It did well. That's all there is to this one. What was its core innovation? The fact it could display something handheld game systems were displaying for decades? Yeah, big whoop. Holy shit. That's fucking purple! The Game Boy Color is an odd duck, so many consider it to be a true successor to the original Game Boy. I'm one of those swine. But others consider it to be an upgraded Game Boy and nothing more. Something along the lines of the PS4 Pro to the PS4, the DSi to the DS, the new 3DS to the 3DS. Obviously, these were superior pieces of hardware to their predecessors, but they weren't generational leaps in quality. They were fundamentally better running systems to play the same games on. They may have had a handful of exclusive games, but fundamentally, they were still that same old system nobody wanted anymore. I think Nintendo themselves have this mentality with the Color, because usually whenever they spoke about how many units the Game Boy or Game Boy Colors sold in their lifetimes, they would usually group them together. Here's my problem with that. Yes, these console upgrades sometimes have their own exclusive games that can only play on them specifically, but they're usually few and far between. I can count on 5 body parts how many Nintendo DSi exclusive games were released to stores. The Game Boy Color had hundreds of games that only worked on the Game Boy Color, definitely more than a lot of other systems that were considered their own thing, so I don't care. The Game Boy Color, to me, will always be the first true successor to the original handheld. It's its own system. If I defend a game system this much, do you think it'll notice? So what's the deal with this thing? Well, the Game Boy Color is fundamentally a souped-up Game Boy. It was released in the latter half of 1998 worldwide because in the background, Nintendo was working on a much more advanced handheld to be released later. This was released to keep the Game Boy relevant and stop it from feeling too outdated and obsolete. The design of this handheld is one of the most iconic relics from the 90s, which is crazy considering it's so damn similar to previous models. Everything's laid out in the same way, it's nearly identical to previous designs, but I don't know how they did it. They made the Game Boy Color have its own unique look. You can immediately look at this and tell it's a Game Boy Color and not an original Game Boy. The shape is slightly tweaked, proportions are a bit different, it's the same general design, but updated in great ways that not only make it a better system, but add to its own character and charm. It does feel a bit more kiddie now though. See, the original Game Boy, this looks like a tool. This looks more like a toy, especially with the logo. Well, in terms of new features, the Color has no feature. No more contrast dial. Oh my god, that was my favorite part of the original Game Boy. It gave all games hard mode. This was always there because the screens were never great and you'd have to adjust them based on your lighting conditions. Here on the Color, they were so confident with this screen, they removed it entirely. And this is a much better screen, but it's still not lit up. Strange considering the Game Boy Light released before this and the big fancy new one went back to a non-lit display. Nintendo's fire code must have been strict. Now, obviously it wasn't included to keep costs down, but under normal lighting conditions, it looks fine, it's just not ideal. We only need 2 AA's to power this bad boy, or you can plug it into the wall with an AC adapter. I've never seen somebody do this with an old school Game Boy. There's an IR blaster on the top, basically the same thing used on most TV remotes. It's not used in a ton of games, but when it was used, it was mainly just a way to transfer stuff like high scores to other players. Thank God the screen wasn't lit for us to get this. The buttons all have a comfortable, slightly rubbery feel to them, and I like that. They are all slightly smaller than I may prefer, but hey, at the time, this was the definitive Game Boy if you hated seeing things. So to quote any parent who picks this up, what the f is this? The Game Boy Color works as a regular old Game Boy. You can play all your old cartridges, with some of them having added color to them. Most of the time, the color added is literally just... Well, now the game's not completely colorless. There's faint color added here and there, but it's not enough to really say, oh wow, all my Game Boy games are in color now. They just use different color palettes in these games. They never programmed Wheel of Fortune to have color, so the Game Boy Color adds a faint dab of it here and there in very smart ways, so it doesn't look out of place or anything. It's still pretty much black and white, but what once were varying shades of gray on the original model are now varying shades of certain other colors. You can actually change the color palettes on the old Game Boy games with different color combinations on the startup screen. Like I said, a nice little bonus, though it's not full color and it's not like it changes any of these games. But hey, if you ever wondered what color the sky was in Mario Land, God, you need this thing right now. Speaking of Mario Land, a few select original Game Boy games had specific colors programmed for them, so if you'd play them on the Super Game Boy adapter for the Super Nintendo or later on the Game Boy Color, they'd be more colorized than other Game Boy games, though not like that much more. But that's just the original Game Boy games. The Game Boy Color also plays special Game Boy games that take advantage of the new hardware. The Game Boy Color Enhanced games are just standard Game Boy cartridges with a splash of color on them, normally black. These play perfectly fine on both systems, but if you have a sense of self-worth, you play them on the Game Boy Color to see everything in Crayola flavors. Basically, these are Game Boy Color games that also run on the original Game Boy. But then we have the games that are apparently too good to to be seen on the original Game Boy models. These have distinct Game Boy Color logos on the cartridges, are translucent, and have convex tops. Easiest way to put it, the original Game Boy cartridges you could use as pill organizers. Game Boy Color, not so much. These games take advantage not only of the color, but the upgraded hardware as well. But here's what I find really bizarre. Nintendo went to all the trouble to ensure by looking at the game cartridges, you could tell what played on the original Game Boy and what couldn't. But the original cardboard boxes these games came in, they only said Game Boy Color on the front. Even if it played on the original Game Boy, you'd have to turn it around to see if it could play on the original. Now, the exclusive games generally had only for Game Boy Color on the box, but the fact that I just realized that, like, right now, I am shocked there wasn't nearly as much confusion when these games came out. I mean, a lot of these Game Boy Color games that said Game Boy Color on the box played on the original Game Boy no problem. Now, if you tried to play Game Boy Color only games on the original Game Boy, you'd get unique screens telling you to piss out. I always liked that many of these games didn't just display generic error messages. Just seeing a logo or special design is a cool little detail. But whatever, what matters is the games on the Game Boy Color and what released on it. So what released on it? Well, here in North America, we got 4 titles that launched alongside the system, and it was just a bunch of old shit. Tetris DX, so this is Tetris again. We have full color and some very basic different modes to play in, but it doesn't feel really all too distinct from the original Game Boy Tetris, and it lacks the iconic Tetris theme. Alright, this is going in the pile. Game & Watch Gallery 2! So, the Game & Watch Gallery games were compilations of the old school LCD Game & Watch units Nintendo would make. They're all very simple games, and Gallery took those titles and remade them with Mario characters and some new twists, while also incorporating the original versions as well. I couldn't have thought of anything better to launch with this brand new high-tech Game Boy. Game & Watch games. Centipede, yeah, that was a graphical showcase. And Pocket Bomberman, which in all fairness is a cool Bomberman title. It's actually more of a side-scrolling platformer compared to the traditional overhead Bomberman games. Yep, can't think of better games to launch a system with. These all worked on the original Game Boy. The Game Boy Color has a weird library, and I think the launch titles are indicative of that. I know I said how I consider it to be its own system, but so many of the titles that are labeled as Game Boy Color games are just Game Boy games that display in color when you pop them in the system. But there were still tons of games that were exclusive to the Game Boy Color that took advantage of the better hardware. But it just so happened around the time the Color released, Nintendo got really weird with what they considered publishing worthy. I would scream if they ever decided to publish a game called Little Mermaid 2 Pinball Frenzy. Nintendo's output was incredibly strange on this thing. If I had to guess why, I'd say it's because they didn't want to fully commit to dropping the original Game Boy in favor of the Game Boy Color, so they kept at it with these cross-compatible releases for a while, and by the time they really started to put out color-exclusive titles, the Game Boy Advance was right around the corner. This thing was the new kid in town for only 3 years, so Nintendo really didn't pour a ton of support into it. Because of this, we got a lot of re-releases, reimaginings, and games that were companion titles to N64 games. Let this sink in. One of the defining Game Boy Color games was a re-release of an original Game Boy game, The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening DX. It was Link's Awakening in color. Yep. I get a little miffed when they decide to re-release games on platforms that could already play those games. You could already play Link's Awakening on the Game Boy Color with just the Game Boy cartridge. Why not remake Zelda 1 or 2 for the handheld? To be fair, they did add a few things, like a brand new optional dungeon to explore that focused on color-based puzzles, and with DX actually getting the full color treatment, it really made this the definitive version at the time. This is a fantastic game. It was just an old one. Of course, this re-release worked on the original Game Boy as well, good for it, but what about something that could have only run on the Game Boy Color? Well, lucky for us, Nintendo put out the original Donkey Kong Country on the system. Holy shit, this is raw. I mean, at the time, this was a pretty faithful interpretation of the original SNES game. It was always amazing seeing what once was a home console game run on a handheld. And Donkey Kong Country on Game Boy Color, it's obviously downgraded and not the ideal way to play, but they did it alright. I mean, the original Game Boy had the Donkey Kong Land games, and the Game Boy Color version of Country was definitely a step up from those. This is a neat little novelty, but not much more than that nowadays. What about Super Mario Bros. Deluxe? This was the original NES game, but with so many new features and bells and whistles, you could go backwards in this one. They added an overworld map, a save feature, more modes like You vs. Boo, where you race a Boo to the end of the level. The original Super Mario Bros. 2 can be unlocked. We have a calendar? This is an incredible version of Super Mario Bros. The one issue is that the screen is so zoomed in, it can be a nightmare to play. Yeah, because the aspect ratio of the Game Boy Color was so skinny and the screen itself was so tiny, everything is crunched onto the screen, and because of that, it does require a bit of getting used to. Back in the day, this was the best option to play Mario 1 on the go, but now when I play this, I just think, my god, it doesn't have to be this way. Nintendo always does this thing where they make the definitive version of one of their games, but it would have like one massive downside. It happens every time. Donkey Kong Country Returns 3D. It includes brand new content, a new difficulty mode, it gets rid of the motion controls from the Wii version, it doesn't look as nice, it runs at half the frame rate. Come on! Mario Tennis and Mario Golf released on the Nintendo 64, so in tandem with that, they made some Game Boy Color versions. These are completely different. While the console versions were basically sports party games, these are full-blown RPGs. You play as children, and your goal is to try to beat Mario at sports. IGN gave Golf a 10 out of 10. I'm definitely more of a golf guy, but these are both still solid titles. I'd say give them a shot purely based on the fact that they are exactly what you don't expect a Mario sports game to be. Like, who are these people? But what about the wackier, more experimental side of Nintendo? Well, there was Kirby Tilt and Tumble, a motion control game with a tuner/accelerometer. You tilt the Game Boy around to move Kirby. It was incredibly novel and still works best on the original Game Boy Color. It was designed for this hardware-specific build, but you can play it on the Game Boy Player on the GameCube if you're a masochist. Wario Land 2 and 3 were on here, with 2 being released for the Game Boy and then being released for the Game Boy Color later. The Game Boy Color release still worked on the original Game Boy. Why is this so confusing to me? Wario Land 3 was a full-on Game Boy Color exclusive though. I don't know much about the meat of Wario Land. I'm more of a bread guy. Basically, I've played 1 and 4. But Nintendo's crowning achievements on the Game Boy Color are obviously The Legend of Zelda, Oracle of Seasons, and Oracle of Ages. Original Zelda titles. These are very much cut from the same cloth as Link's Awakening. They look very similar, but these were developed by Capcom, and they went for the Pokemon approach of selling 2 games that were kind of sort of the same. The Oracle games are more so 2 chapters of one story, where you can play them in either order. Whatever one you finish, you get a code to enter in the other game, and you see how they connect. It's a brilliant idea that was only done this one time for Zelda. But of course, if we're talking games that had a dual release that were kind of sort of the same, but not really, yeah, sure, Pokemon. Pokemon Yellow was sort of kind of a Game Boy Color game. It had some color enhancements thrown in there, but the core of the game was still a classic Game Boy title. Pokemon Gold and Silver were made from the ground up for the Game Boy Color. They worked on the original Game Boy. Are you fucking kidding me? Well, the enhanced version of Gold and Silver Crystal released as a Game Boy Color exclusive. Look at that cartridge shape. It can't be anything but a Game Boy Color exclusive. Where the was the only for Game Boy Color logo on the box?
How is nobody confused?
The Game Boy Color was definitely where more and more Pokemon spin-offs were starting to show their head. The trading card game, pinball, puzzle challenge, they were definitely up to do weirder stuff back then. Speaking of which, Nintendo didn't do a ton of huge first-party stuff on this machine, but they published damn near anything they could. Quest for Camelot? Go for it. Bugs Bunny's Crazy Castle 3? Why not? Beauty and the Beast, a board game adventure? F it. Hamtaro, Ham Hams Unite? I've heard worse. Little Mermaid 2, Pinball Frenzy? What may be even weirder is Nintendo's internal American development studio, Nintendo Software Technology, developed the games Bionic Commando Elite Forces and Crystalis, with Nintendo as a whole publishing them. These were Capcom and SNK properties that Nintendo just decided to develop and publish on the Game Boy Color. Like I said, their output was weird on this thing. And not only that, but we got games that nobody ever expected on this handheld. Metal Gear Solid, Resident Evil Gaiden, Tomb Raider, Driver, GTA 2, and many of these actually played fairly well. There were tons of cool games developers tried to bring over to the Game Boy Color, and shockingly, many of them worked out fairly well. Not only that, but series like Dragon Quest and Mega Man came over gracefully, and new ones like Tokitori and Shantae started out here. It's still a weird fucking handheld.
I may have been wrong about this thing. This system isn't nearly as in-depth as I thought it was. A lot of the games that were labeled as Game Boy Color titles were just Game Boy games with colors programmed into them. Even Nintendo support on this thing was really weird and lackluster. We got a few original Zeldas, some ports and remakes, Mario sports titles, and enhanced Pokemon. That's basically it. But still, original Zeldas and a Pokemon. Those are huge games for Nintendo to just put them on a simple upgraded Game Boy if it was only a simple upgraded Game Boy. What the f*** was this thing? An excuse for me to waste 17 minutes.
Hey y'all, Scott here. So I was just working on my definitive list of Nintendo consoles with microphones on them.
Yeah, the Game Boy Advance didn't make the list. That's actually a good thing. It's fairly annoying to have to blow into the microphone or something for a game. But I actually found a loophole with some Nintendo systems where you don't actually have to blow into the mic. So all you have to do is grab your system, grab an air horn, bring it close,
Your entire life you come to expect this, but then Nintendo decides to throw this at you. Oh, f***, the letters are evolving! This is the Game Boy Advance, the last survivor of the Game Boy line, starting with the Game Boy in 1989, upgrading to the Game Boy Color in 1998, and finally reaching the final evolution, the GBA in 2001. And after everything was said and done, I think it's fair to say they ended the line on a high note. The Game Boy Advance was pretty much the ultimate Game Boy. Most of the models played all previous Game Boy games. The GBA's own game library was seemingly endless, and certain revisions introduced features that we may take for granted today, but back then it was like, whoa, the Game Boy folds? This was the first system I owned brand new that wasn't a hand-me-down, and I hold it close to my heart. And it all started back in the mid-90s. The original Game Boy was starting to lose steam. I mean, bless Nintendo's heart. They were able to make this thing last over a decade, but at some point you just gotta look at Game Boy Mortal Kombat and say it's time to move on. This original black and white chunk of a portable was aging rapidly, and Nintendo wanted to create a new handheld that was far more powerful. Enter Project Atlantis. This was an ambitious planned successor to the original Game Boy. With 32-bit hardware, a larger screen, battery life of up to 30 hours, this was 1995. My 3DS doesn't even last 5 hours playing Wario's Woods. Rumors and reports consistently were floating around about Atlantis, and Nintendo did confirm its existence back in the day and originally planned to release it in 1996, before delaying it into obscurity and then just simply shelving the idea. Atlantis was simply far ahead of its time. The system was proving to be too expensive to manufacture and too large for Nintendo's liking. They opted to release revisions and upgrades to the original Game Boy instead to keep interest up. We got the Game Boy Pocket in 1996, the Game Boy Light, a Game Boy with a backlight in 1998 only in Japan, and the Game Boy Color also in 1998. You will find me dead in the ground before I admit the Game Boy Color was simply an upgrade to the original model. I've always considered the Color to be its own system, the first true successor to the Game Boy. It just had so many exclusive games. But it turns out Nintendo just looked at it as more of a souped up Game Boy rather than a true successor. Think the Nintendo DSi to the DS, or the new 3DS to the 3DS. Because of that, a true next-generation Game Boy was still being thought of, and while it didn't end up being Project Atlantis, a few of the core ideas that made up that project were incorporated into this new one, codenamed Advanced Game Boy. Oh, I wonder what the final name will be. Initially announced in September of 1999 and fully unveiled at Nintendo's Space World event on August 24th, 2000, the Game Boy Advance was the most radically different looking Game Boy yet. It's long. Oh, and I can play Mario Kart. This was the main game Nintendo was flaunting with the GBA during its unveil. It was always really cool for me to see what used to be home console-only series finally making the jump to portable systems, so to have a Mario Kart playable on the go was honestly amazing and easily showcased how powerful this system was at the time. The rest of the GBA titles at Space World during this unveil were just Silent Hill for Game Boy Advance. Was I the only one to not know they made a remake of Silent Hill 1 in the form of a visual novel for the Game Boy Advance as a launch title? Was I? Konami was a big supporter for the system at the event, showing off a new Castlevania and Konami Crazy Racer. Sure, I can deal with this existing. Mega Man Battle Network, Advance Wars, and Golden Sun were also shown off at Space World, with the GBA's launch price announced to be $100. It launched in Japan on March 21st, 2001, here in North America on June 11th, and in Europe on June 22nd. The purple Game Boy Advance was the one I owned, and compared to previous Game Boys, Nintendo definitely decided to widen things out with this model. You know what, compared to the regular format of Game Boy systems up to this point, the original Game Boy Advance is really comfortable, and being in this landscape form factor, in my opinion, balances this whole thing out a lot better than old Hamtaro player over there. Unlike the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, the Advance has 2 whole shoulder buttons, that's it, that's why they called it the Advance. Yeah, you'd think they would have given this thing 4 face buttons as well, but it's whatever. I can take just the shoulder buttons, they're a fine addition. I like how fat and long the shoulder buttons are, it makes them so much more comfortable than every other Nintendo handheld with shoulder buttons. And I do like all the buttons here in general. Everything has a nice softer plastic feel while still feeling incredibly sturdy. It still takes batteries, 2 AA's, and the screen. What the hell am I looking at? This was the biggest drawback of the Game Boy Advance. The screen didn't have a backlight, front light, nothing. It was completely dependent on the lighting around you, and even in the best possible conditions, it was still hard to see the screen. It was never a huge issue, but it was always something that was less than desirable. It's something I can look back at now and say, oh my god, I put up with this? That's when you have to break out the accessories. I'm pretty sure some people built empires out of the Game Boy Advance light business. Here we have Worm Light. Just gotta plug it into this port and blam, I can finally see what I was playing. Oh my god. Like I said, the screen was tolerable, but the Sega Game Gear back in 1990 had a backlight. The Atari Lynx had one in 1989. How Nintendo made the Game Boy Light a few years earlier, with the entire selling point being the backlight. So the fact that this advanced Game Boy didn't have one, was kind of ridiculous, let's be honest here. Game cartridges were half the size of traditional Game Boy games, yet they packed a way bigger punch. You could still play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games here with the trusty shoulder buttons commanding the video to go widescreen or go back to the aspect ratio God intended. Now all of this is great, but still, that screen, man, it honestly keeps the GBA away from reaching pure greatness. Well, only 2 years later, in 2003, the Game Boy Advance SP released, a full redesign with features that have become Nintendo staples ever since. A lit screen, a clamshell design to protect the screen and become even smaller, and a rechargeable battery. The SP stood for special, and they weren't kidding. I'd consider this to be one of the most important console releases in Nintendo history. This is honestly what I think of when I hear GBA. It's so compact, and the screen actually being usable makes a huge difference. Who would have thought? Now, this wasn't a big problem back in the day, but I do find the smaller size of the SP to be less comfortable than the original. These are tic-tac shoulder buttons. Everything feels a bit better with the old one. Nothing's outright bad here, but I do think the original had a perfect balance of being compact, yet comfortable for big and small hands alike. That's not to say the SP isn't comfortable to play, but just in comparison to the original, I think that one's better. And while we're whining about the SP, let me just get this one out of the way. Where's the headphone jack? To save space and money on this unit, Nintendo didn't include a headphone jack. You had to buy an adapter that goes into the charging port. This was honestly never something I thought of as a kid, but I can assure you it annoyed at least one person out there. Plus, if you use the adapter, you can't charge the Game Boy while using headphones. This isn't a modern smartphone, this is a Game Boy, damn it. Other than those little complaints, the SP is the definitive Game Boy. I had the flame red color, and I sunk so much time to this thing. You could play old Game Boy games, new ones too, finally with a screen you can actually see, a rechargeable battery, a stupidly compact design, and Nintendo said, "F it, we made it better." When you look into buying a Game Boy Advance SP nowadays, you may see people specify what model number they have, AGS-001 or AGS-101. The main difference is the quality of the screen's light. 101 has a full backlight, and it is a huge upgrade. This thing is leagues better. The original SP did the job and is perfectly usable, but this is even more usable. That's the only difference between these models, the quality of the screen brightness. You can definitely get by with an AGS-001, but if you don't want to be a fucking loser, then yeah, the 101 is for you. The Game Boy Advance line up to this point was a tremendous success. This was fundamentally how Nintendo made most of their money during the GameCube era. They sold nearly 80 million units of these systems combined. But when 2004 came around, Nintendo released the Nintendo DS for some reason. This was weird because they made it clear this was no replacement for the GBA, rather it was another pillar for their handheld business. Was that some kind of joke? It ultimately was the replacement for the GBA, and they didn't want to say that because that would kill the GBA's sales, plus the DS was a risky move at the time, so if it failed, they could just keep supporting the Advance. I never really got the whole "it's not a replacement" shtick because they said the DS was backwards compatible with the GBA, implying, you know, it was the successor. But releasing the DS in 2004, that was odd. The GBA was such a successful system, and after only 3 years they released a new handheld? Games continued to come out for the Game Boy Advance after that point. It didn't mark the end of the system, but still. After the DS release, Nintendo wasn't finished with new Game Boy models. We got one final Game Boy Advance revision, which was also the final Game Boy in general. This was a giant failure. The Game Boy Micro released in 2005 to 2.5 million lifetime sales and getting discontinued 3 years later. This was in the era Nintendo was kinda trying to mimic Apple. The DS and Wii's marketing always gave me iPod vibes, and the Game Boy Micro sorta felt like their take on something like the iPod Nano. A budget gaming device all about looks and being tiny. The Micro removed Game Boy and Game Boy Color support, which makes it far less useful than the SP. It doesn't work with certain accessories, and its small size can definitely be annoying to some. This is a tiny thing. It almost needs to be seen to be believed. I didn't realize how small the Micro was until holding one for myself, and I hate to admit, but I fell in love with this thing. The Game Boy Micro is one of the most beautiful devices Nintendo's ever created. The screen is absolutely gorgeous, a bit better than the SP-101 actually. It can only play Game Boy Advance games, which is kind of a bummer, but hey, the library is so big that it doesn't matter that much. This is definitely more of a novelty rather than a definitive way to play Game Boy games, but if you can find it for a cheap price, go for it. This is the Famicom Special Edition, made in commemoration of the system's 20th anniversary, but a key attribute of the Micro was swappable faceplates to make your own special edition. It had a lot of cool ideas, but this was definitely not a necessary revision of the Advance. With a launch price of $100 in 2005, it was simply too pricey. It was a far less functional Game Boy Advance coming out after the DS release for $150. That could also play GBA games, and you could find an SP for much cheaper which could play all the Game Boy games in the world, so this was more of a device you buy to make some kind of a fashion statement rather than to just play some games. It may have failed and may be sort of worthless compared to the SP, but I love this thing, it's so cool. I personally think each of the GBA models have strengths compared to each other. The original is the most comfortable, the SP gives you a lit screen, clamshell design, and rechargeable battery, and the Micro is the sleekest and coolest looking. But I think it's pretty obvious, if you had to get one, it would have to be the SP101 model. While the Micro has a slightly better screen, this can play all Game Boy games, the screen is already great and is cheaper than the Micro. Now, why would you buy a Game Boy Advance today? Because this thing has an amazing library of games, over 1,500 titles, 1,400 of them being re-releases. Yeah, that was definitely a trend with the Game Boy Advance, old games thrown onto the system, maybe with a few tweaks here and there, some additions, some alterations, but hey, back then, this was awesome. It was great to be able to play a lot of these legendary games portably, but looking at the first-party lineup now, I have to admit, it's a bit disappointing. Sure, good games are still good games, regardless of if they're ports, albeit if they're good ports. Back in 2002, I had no idea Yoshi's Island on the GBA was an old game, and I'm sure other people who grew up with a re-release of a game didn't think of it as an old game, it was just a game. And for the people who played these games on the original systems, it was still pretty cool to be able to play these things portably for the first time ever. However, it does make the Game Boy Advance lack a bit of its own image, and there were simply so many ports and remakes from Nintendo and other companies as well, that now I kind of look at the system as just a portable Super Nintendo and not much else. Because that's where a lot of its most memorable games came from. A good chunk of Nintendo's main series all got remakes or ports, plus one original title. But weirdly enough, the Mario series was an exception. Anybody else find it odd that there was not a single traditional original Mario game on the GBA? There were a lot of Mario games, no doubt, but no traditional platformer. Instead, we got the Super Mario Advance series. These were 4 remakes of 2D Mario titles. Super Mario Advance was a remake of Super Mario Bros. 2 USA, followed up by Super Mario World, Super Mario Advance 2, Yoshi's Island, Super Mario Advance 3, and Super Mario Advance 4, Super Mario Bros. 3. These names make me queasy, and I also don't know why they felt the need to shuffle all the games out of chronological order like that. These remakes were pretty solid though. Some of them took versions of these games from Super Mario All-Stars on the Super Nintendo and squished them onto a GBA cartridge, adding stuff like cutscenes and new sound effects while also changing a few things here and there. Mario Advance 1 and 4 are easily the most unique. Mario World and Yoshi's Island are pretty similar to the original games. I hear people cry about the Yoshi's Island port all the time, screaming it's just not the same. I personally always felt like people were a bit too picky with that. Like sure, the SNES version is definitely the better version, but the GBA release is perfectly fine, like it's still Yoshi's Island, it's just not as nice graphically. Advance 4 was a remake of Mario 3, and it is easily the coolest one of the bunch. They added a ton of stuff, and they changed loads of animations and graphics amongst all the Advance games to make them less dated and weird. Like the scene in Mario 3 always made me fidget in my seat. Here in Advance 4, it looks much more natural. All the Mario Advance games came with a remake of the original Mario Bros. Arcade game, and I love this thing. This is the best version of Mario Bros. In my opinion. The physics are actually tolerable in this version. Main problem with remakes on the GBA though? Screen crunch. These games weren't made for a display this tiny, so they had to zoom in the view a bit, which ends up cutting some things off the screen and leads to you running into enemies you couldn't see or not being able to see as much ahead of you. It is a bit annoying, but it can be dealt with. That sadly does make some of these remakes not as good as the originals by default, when if it wasn't for the screen crunch, they'd potentially be the definitive versions. While these remakes help supply enough Mario content for GBA players, it was still odd to me that they didn't have an original Mario platformer. Instead, we got a whole lot of side games. Mario vs. Donkey Kong was a puzzle platformer that was pretty much another Donkey Kong 94 from the original Game Boy. That game was amazing, and this one is also pretty great. You just control Mario going through all these puzzle rooms with loads of acrobatics and keys. This was the introduction of the Mini Mario toys, where they then took over the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series with the second game, and we never got to see this style again. Nothing screams Weird Kid on the Bus playing Game Boy Advance more than Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga. The first in the Mario & Luigi series of RPGs, and potentially the best one. This was the main entry I got into, and yeah, it's definitely a fun one. A wacky RPG where you control both Mario and Luigi, and it also included the Mario Brothers arcade game. Well, now I've gotta say this is the best game of all time. Not all the Mario Game Boy Advance games were winners, though. Care for some Mario Pinball Land? This was weird. They had to structurally reform Mario from the inside out to even get this concept to work. It's okay, I guess. It's just kind of annoying to play for me. These physics never felt like the most right thing in the world to me. Two series that finally made their way onto portable systems with the GBA were Mario Kart and Mario Party. Mario Kart Super Circuit was an original Mario Kart, but included the entirety of Super Mario Kart's tracks as well, which makes sense because Super Circuit is the most similar to Super Mario Kart. The characters kind of look like how they did in Mario Kart 64, but everything else is pretty Super Mario Kart-y. It's a decent enough portable Mario Kart for the time, and just nothing really worth going back to now. Mario Party Advance, I never played, but can you really blame me? It's Mario Party Advance. Camelot made the Mario Tennis and Mario Golf games for the system, as they usually do, but they also worked on their own RPGs for the Game Boy Advance, the Golden Sun games. Golden Sun's a pretty traditional RPG, but with graphics like these, it really stood out on the system. Of course, blown up on a big display, they look kinda rough, but on the original screen, they looked stellar. Yeah, this was a solid game on the system, and that's coming from your local RPG hate and fling smash owner. Nintendo put out a lot of stuff on this thing we hadn't seen prior here in North America. The GBA was the first time Fire Emblem and Advance Wars left Japan. That was huge. These series have been going on since the Famicom, so to finally get them in the States was awesome. Sure, we did get a Fire Emblem anime on VHS here in North America in 1997, but does that really count? Metroid got 2 games, Metroid Fusion in 2002 and a remake of Metroid 1, Metroid Zero Mission in 2004, 2 fantastic Metroid experiences. A new original game in the definitive way to play the first one. Fusion is considered Metroid 4 and is just a good 2D Metroid game, the last original 2D Metroid game for like decades, but hey, at least we got Zero Mission as well. A very necessary update to Metroid 1. Zelda had a similar presence. We got a port of Link to the Past featuring a new multiplayer side mode, Four Swords, which later was expanded into its own game on the GameCube, Four Swords Adventures. But the big one was the Minish Cap, developed by Capcom. This is such a great Zelda game. It's just pure top-down Zelda fun. You have a talking hat. I made it clear that, hey, I love what I play of the Zelda games, but I barely finish them. I'm making an oath right now, though, that I will finish the Minish Cap. Kirby's Nightmare in Dreamland was a great remake of Kirby's Adventure, and Kirby and the Amazing Mirror was a neat little multiplayer-focused Kirby game. It's actually one of the most unique mainline Kirby games out there. Wario actually took over from Mario in terms of original platformers. We got Wario Land 4! The Wario Land series always weirded me out. Like, it started with the third Mario Land game, it became its own series and really plays nothing like a Mario game. Which I'm fine with, it's just weird that it all started out with a game titled Mario Land 3. Which is the same as the Yoshi series, starting with a game called Mario World 2. The Sonic Advance series was one of the best things THQ's ever published. It was a fun modernization of 2D Sonic. I still prefer the original classic style, but this was great for the time, and I'd love to see something like this return. The Castlevania GBA games, oh my god. These were amazing handheld entries in the series following the success of Symphony of the Night. I played the first one, Circle of the Moon, and it is so good. Just exploring this giant map, finding upgrades to lead to more areas, it's what you'd want and expect out of a post-Symphony of the Night Castlevania game. Mega Man games were everywhere, especially Battle Network. This was a complete departure from standard Mega Man. It's a side series, tactical RPGs. They made 6. I've heard some of these games were quite good, although they definitely made too many of them. There were the Mega Man Zero games, definitely more in line with what we'd expect from Mega Man, and who could forget Mega Man and Bass, a Super Famicom game that left Japan for the first time on the GBA. It wasn't good. But hey, we actually got F-Zero games on this thing, can you believe it? Pokemon happened here, of course. We got a new generation with Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald alongside remakes of the first generation, Fire Red and Leaf Green. But you know me, I'm not big into Pokemon. I think I figured out why though. You see, I didn't grow up with it, and I feel like Pokemon just isn't easy to get into if you didn't grow up with it. But the GBA was how millions experienced Pokemon for the first time, and that can't be undervalued. But of course, like I said, the Game Boy Advance was a re-release fiend. The Donkey Kong Country series, Contra 3, Final Fantasy, Street Fighter, Phantasy Star, Namco Museum, Doom, Earthworm Jim, Mega Man and Bass, oh Jesus, Sonic Genesis, oh f***. There was also the classic NES series, a bunch of old NES games released as cartridges for 20 bucks a pop. I love the packaging here, and the cartridges are even colored to look more like NES games. But some of these titles just were not worth that much money. Japan got cooler boxes though, with tiny replicas of Famicom boxes and neat outer plastic shells. Like I said, the amount of ports is a bit disappointing, but they at least mean the GBA had a rock-solid library. Sure, the DS and 3DS probably had more original new titles from Nintendo and major third parties, but the GBA's library at the time was phenomenal. The fact you could play all these amazing games portably was mind-blowing, and it had some great original new games on top of that. Like Drill Dozer, when Game Freak had some free time between making Pokemon games, they pumped this thing out. You have a giant drill, it's good. It even had Rumble implanted into the cartridge. They had a few of these tumor carts. There was Yoshi Topsy-Turvy with a tilt sensor, nobody needs this, but WarioWare Twisted had a gyroscope. This is still considered as one of the best WarioWare games to many, and hey, WarioWare started on the GBA. I adore WarioWare! Quick bite-sized micro games getting flung at you at lightning speed, it's so great, and the Advance got 2 of them. While its library may have been a bit been there, done that heavy, there was still a little bit of something for everyone on the GBA. It was fairly powerful enough to do things that still impress me. Loads of games still look good to this day. While it was obvious it primarily exceeded at 2D games, seeing 3D stuff run in the system was pretty crazy back then and still impressive now. And it could play episodes of Sonic X. Game Boy Advance Video, cartridges that contained episodes of TV shows with a few movie releases. I owned a few of these back then, and it was pretty cool to watch Nickelodeon shows on my Game Boy. I guess these were made to compete with the portable media craze with iPods, portable DVD players, and the Video Now. I love this thing. Watching these cartridges now? Well, it could be worse. Oh yeah, it definitely could. The e-reader! This was an accessory, alright. Nintendo created this thing to scan cards that contained code. Swipe a card, the e-reader would read the code, and you would unlock certain things in games, or swipe a bunch of these NES cards and play old school NES games. Yes, if you needed more of a reason to believe the classic NES series was overpriced, here are some dirt cheap cards that play the same game. It's a huge novelty. It's kinda cool, but there's not much of a reason to use this now, or to ever use the e-reader even when it was new. The neatest thing it did though, was add new levels to Mario Advance 4. They designed dozens of brand new levels, some that incorporated elements from games like Mario 2 or Mario World. These are crazy. Now you could track down all those special level cards, or you could just download Mario Advance 4 on the Wii U and blam, all the e-reader levels are unlocked. That's nice. Some GameCube games supported the e-reader, which you'd use by linking up the Game Boy Advance with this cable. You could actually link your GBA with a bunch of games to unlock things or play certain mini games, and sometimes it was recommended, like with Four Swords Adventures or Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles. The GameCube also had the Game Boy Player, which allowed to play all Game Boy games on the TV. You see, there was a god, and it was Nintendo in 2003 when they released this thing. But out of all Game Boy Advance accessories or models, they all pale in comparison to the Vistion Dockable Entertainment featuring Game Boy Advance. An entertainment system for vehicles that could also play Game Boy Advance games with a wireless controller. This is by far the most unique and mind-blowing Game Boy Advance model of all time that's sure to put anybody who comes in contact with it into a state of shock and awe.
Oh, it's a Game Boy.